Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Amazing Stories. Amazing Stories is an American science fiction magazine launched in April 1926 by Hugo Gernsback's Experimenter Publishing. It was the first magazine devoted solely to science fiction. Science fiction stories had made regular appearances in other magazines, including some published by Gernsback, but Amazing helped define and launch a new genre of pulp fiction. Amazing was published, with some interruptions, for almost 80 years, going through a half-dozen owners and many editors as it struggled to be profitable. Gernsback was forced into bankruptcy and lost control of the magazine in 1929, and by 1938 it was purchased by Ziff-Davis, who hired Raymond A. Palmer as editor. Palmer made the magazine successful, though it was not regarded as a quality magazine within the science fiction community. In the late 1940s, Amazing presented as fact stories about the Shaver mystery, a lurid mythos that explained accidents and disaster as the work of robots named deros, which led to dramatically increased circulation, but widespread ridicule. Amazing switched to a digest-size format in 1953, shortly before the end of the pulp magazine era. It was sold to Saul Cohen's Universal Publishing Company in 1965, which filled it with reprinted stories, but did not pay a reprint fee to the authors, creating a conflict with the newly formed Science Fiction Writers of America. Ted White took over as editor in 1969, eliminated the reprints, and made the magazine respected again. Amazing was nominated for the prestigious Hugo Award 3 times during his tenure in the 1970s. Several other owners attempted to create a modern incarnation of the magazine in the following decades, but publication was suspended after the March 2005 issue. A new incarnation appeared in July 2012 as an online magazine. Gernsback's initial editorial approach was to blend instruction with entertainment. He believed science fiction could educate readers. His audience rapidly showed a preference for implausible adventures, however, and the movement away from Gernsback's idealism accelerated when the magazine changed hands in 1929. Despite this, Gernsback had an enormous impact on the field. The creation of a specialist magazine for science fiction spawned an entire genre publishing industry. The letter columns in Amazing, where fans could make contact with each other, led to the formation of science fiction fandom, which in turn had a strong influence on the development of the field. Writers whose first story was published in the magazine include John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Howard Fast, Ursula K. Le Guin, Roger Zelazny, and Thomas M. Dish. Overall, though, Amazing itself was rarely an influential magazine within the genre after the 1920s. Some critics have commented that by ghettoizing science fiction, Gernsback in fact did harm to its literary growth, but this viewpoint has been countered by the argument that science fiction needed an independent market to develop and to reach its potential. Origins. By the end of the 19th century, stories centered on scientific inventions, and stories set in the future, were appearing regularly in popular fiction magazines. The market for short stories lent itself to tales of invention in the tradition of Jules Verne. Magazines such as Munsey's Magazine and The Argosy, launched in 1889 and 1896 respectively, carried a few science fiction stories each year. Some upmarket, slick magazines such as McClure's, which paid well and were aimed at a more literary audience, also carried scientific stories, but by the early years of the 20th century, science fiction was appearing more often in the pulp magazines than in the slicks. In 1908, Hugo Gernsback published the first issue of Modern Electrics, a magazine aimed at the scientific hobbyist. It was an immediate success, and Gernsback began to include articles on imaginative uses of science, such as wireless on Saturn. In April 1911, Gernsback began the serialization of his science fiction novel, Ralph 124C41+, but in 1913 he sold his interest in the magazine to his partner and launched a new magazine, Electrical Experimenter, which soon began to publish scientific fiction. In 1920 Gernsback retitled the magazine Science and Invention, and through the early 1920s he published much scientific fiction in its pages, along with non-fiction scientific articles. Gernsback had started another magazine called Practical Electrics in 1921. In 1924, he changed its name to the Experimenter, and sent a letter to 25,000 people to gauge interest in the possibility of a magazine devoted to scientific fiction. In his words, the response was such that the idea was given up for 2 years. However, in 1926 he decided to go ahead and ceased publication of the Experimenter to make room in his publishing schedule for a new magazine. The editor of the Experimenter, T. O'Connor Sloan, became the editor of Amazing Stories. The first issue appeared on the 10th of March 1926, with a cover date of April 1926. 1920s. Initially the magazine focused on reprints. The first original story was The Man from the Atom by G. Peyton Wirt and Baker in a May 1926 issue. In the August issue, new stories were noted with an asterisk in the table of contents. The editorial work was largely done by Sloan, but Gernsback retained final say over the fiction content. 2 consultants, Comrade A. Brandt and Wilbur C. Whitehead, were hired to help find fiction to reprint. Frank R. Paul, who had worked with Gernsback as early as 1914, became the cover artist. Paul had produced many illustrations for the fiction in the Electrical Experimenter. Amazing was issued in the large bedsheet format, 8.5 x 11.75 in, the same size as the technical magazines. It was an immediate success and by the following March reached a circulation of 150,000. Gernsback saw there was an enthusiastic readership for scientification, and in 1927 started a discussions section and issued Amazing Stories Annual. The annual sold out, and in January 1928, Gernsback launched a quarterly magazine, Amazing Stories Quarterly, as a regular companion to Amazing. It continued on a fairly regular schedule for 22 issues. Gernsback was slow to pay his authors and creditors. The extent of his investments limited his liquidity. On the 20th of February 1929 his printer and paper supplier opened bankruptcy proceedings against him. It has been suggested that Bernard McFadden, another magazine publisher, maneuvered to force the bankruptcy, because Gernsback would not sell his titles to McFadden, but this is unproven. Experimenter Publishing did not file any defense, and was declared bankrupt by default on the 6th of March 1929. Amazing survived with its existing staff, but Hugo and his brother, Sidney, were forced out as directors. Arthur H. Lynch took over as editor-in-chief, though Sloan continued to have effective control of the magazine's contents. The receivers, Irving Trust, sold the magazine to Bergan A. McKinnon on the 3rd of April 1929. 1930s. In August 1931, Amazing was acquired by Tech Publications, a subsidiary of Bernard McFadden's McFadden Publications. McFadden's deep pockets helped insulate Amazing from the financial strain caused by the Great Depression. The schedule of Amazing Stories Quarterly began to slip, but Amazing did not miss an issue in the early 1930s. However, it became unprofitable to publish over the next few years. Circulation dropped to little more than 25,000 in 1934, and in October 1935 it switched to a bi-monthly schedule. By 1938, with Amazing circulation down to only 15,000, Tech Publications was having financial problems. In January 1938 Ziff-Davis took over the magazine and shortly thereafter moved production to Chicago. The April issue was assembled by Sloan, but published by Ziff-Davis. Bernard Davis, who ran Ziff-Davis' editorial department, attempted to hire Roger Sherman Hoare as editor. Hoare turned down the job, but suggested Raymond A. Palmer, an active local science fiction fan. Palmer was hired that February, taking over editorial duties. With the June 1938 issue, Ziff-Davis launched Fantastic Adventures, a fantasy companion to Amazing. In May 1939, also under Palmer's editorship, Palmer quickly managed to improve Amazing's circulation, and in November 1938, the magazine went monthly again. Though this did not last throughout Palmer's tenure, between 1944 and 1946 the magazine was bi-monthly and then quarterly for a while before returning to a longer-lasting monthly schedule. 1940s. In September 1943 Richard Shaver, an Amazing reader, began to correspond with Palmer, who soon asked him to write stories for the magazine. Shaver responded with a story called I Remember Lemuria, published in the March 1945 issue, which was presented by Palmer as a mixture of truth and fiction. The story, about prehistoric civilizations, dramatically boosted Amazing's circulation, and Palmer ran a new shaver story in every issue, culminating in a special issue in June 1947 devoted entirely to the shaver mystery, as it was called. Amazing soon drew ridicule for these stories. A derisive article by William S. Baring Gould in the September 1946 issue of Harper's prompted William Ziff to tell Palmer to limit the amount of shaver-related material in the magazine. Palmer complied, but his interest in this sort of material was now significant, and he soon began planning to leave Ziff-Davis. In 1947 he formed Clark Publications, launching Fate the following year, and in 1949 he resigned from Ziff-Davis to edit that and other magazines. Howard Brown, who had been on a leave of absence from Ziff-Davis to write fiction, took over as editor and began by throwing away 300,000 words of inventory that Palmer had acquired before he left. Brown had ambitions of moving Amazing upmarket, and his argument was strengthened by Street and Smith, one of the longest established and most respected publishers, who shut down all of their pulp magazines in the summer of 1949. The pulps were dying, largely as a result of the success of pocketbooks, and Street and Smith decided to concentrate on their slick magazines. Some pulps struggled on for a few more years, but Brown was able to persuade Ziff and Davis that the future was in the slicks, and they raised his fiction budget from 1 cent to a ceiling of 5 cents per word. Brown managed to get promises of new stories from many well-known authors, including Isaac Asimov and Theodore Sturgeon. He produced a dummy issue in April 1950, and planned to launch the new incarnation of Amazing in April 1951, the 25th anniversary of the first issue. However, the economic impact of the Korean War, which broke out in June 1950, led to budget cuts. The plans were cancelled, and Ziff-Davis never revived the idea. 1950s. Brown's interest in Amazing declined when the project to turn it into a slick magazine was derailed. Although he stayed involved with Fantastic Adventures, another Ziff-Davis magazine, he left the editing work on Amazing to William Hammerling and Leela Schaffer. In December 1950, when Ziff-Davis moved their offices from Chicago to New York, Hammerling stayed behind in Chicago, and Brown revived his involvement with the magazine. In 1952, Brown convinced Ziff-Davis to try a high-quality digest fantasy magazine, Fantastic, which appeared in the summer of that year, focused on fantasy rather than science fiction and was so successful that it persuaded Ziff-Davis to switch Amazing from pulp format to digest in early 1953. Circulation fell, however, and subsequent budget cuts limited the story quality in both Amazing and Fantastic. Fantastic began to print science fiction as well as fantasy. Circulation increased as a result, but Brown, who was not a science fiction aficionado, once again lost interest in the magazines. Paul W. Fireman replaced Brown as editor in September 1956. Early in Fireman's tenure, Bernard Davis decided to try issuing a companion series of novels, titled Amazing Stories Science Fiction Novels. Readers' letters in Amazing had indicated a desire for novels, which Amazing did not have room to run. The novel series did not last. Only one, Henry Slessor's 20 Million Miles to Earth, appeared. However, in response to readers' interest in longer fiction, Ziff-Davis expanded Amazing by 16 pages, starting with the March 1958 issue, and the magazine began to run complete novels. Fireman left to edit Ellery Queen's mystery magazine at the end of 1958, and his place was taken by Shelley Goldsmith. Goldsmith had been hired in 1955 as a secretary and became assistant editor to help cope with the additional work created when Ziff-Davis launched two short-lived magazines, Dream World and Pen Pals. In 1956, Ziff-Davis were not confident of Goldsmith's abilities as an editor, so when Fireman left, a consultant, Norman Lobsans, was hired to work with her. She performed well, however, and Lobsans' involvement soon became minimal. 1960s. Goldsmith is well regarded by science fiction historians for her innovation, and the impact she had on the early careers of writers such as Ursula K. Le Guin and Roger Zelazny, but circulation lagged during her tenure. By 1964, Fantastic's circulation was down to 27,000, with Amazing doing little better. The following March both Amazing and Fantastic were sold to Ultimate Publishing Company, run by Sol Cohen and Arthur Bernhardt. Goldsmith was given the choice of going with the magazines or staying with Ziff-Davis. She stayed, and Cohen hired Joseph Tzos to edit the magazines, starting with the August and September 1965 issues of Amazing and Fantastic, respectively. Tzos used the name Joseph Ross on the mastheads to avoid misspellings. Both magazines immediately moved to a bi-monthly schedule. Cohen had acquired reprint rights to the magazine's back issues, although Tzos did get Cohen to agree to print one new story every issue. Cohen was also producing reprint magazines such as Great Science Fiction and Science Fiction Classics. But no payment was made to authors for any of these reprints. This brought Cohen into conflict with the Science Fiction Writers of America, a professional writers' organization formed in 1965. Soon SFWA called for a boycott of Ultimate's magazines until Cohen agreed to make payments. Cohen agreed to pay a flat fee for all stories, and then in August 1967 this was changed to a graduated rate, depending on the length of the story. Harry Harrison had acted as an intermediary in Cohen's negotiations with SFWA, and when Tzos left in 1967, Cohen asked Harrison to take over. SF Impulse, which Harrison had been editing, had folded in February 1967, so Harrison was available. He secured Cohen's agreement that the policy of printing almost nothing but reprinted stories would be phased out by the end of the year, and took over as editor with the September 1967 issue. By February 1968 Harrison decided to leave, as Cohen was showing no signs of abandoning the reprints. He resigned, and suggested Barry Malzberg to Cohen as a possible successor. Cohen knew Malzberg from his work at the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, and thought that he might be more amenable than Harrison to continuing the reprint policy. Malzberg took over in April 1968, but immediately came into conflict with Cohen over the reprints, and then threatened to resign in October 1968, over a disagreement about artwork Malzberg had commissioned for a cover. Cohen contacted Robert Silverberg, then the president of SFWA, and told him that Malzberg had actually resigned. Silverberg recommended Ted White as a replacement. Cohen secured White's agreement, and then fired Malzberg. White assumed control with the May 1969 issue. 1970s. When White took over as editor, Amazing's circulation was about 38,500, only about 4% of which were subscribers. This was a very low ebb for subscriptions. Analog, by comparison, sold about 35% of its circulation through subscriptions. Cohen's wife mailed out the subscription copies from home, and Cohen had never tried to increase the subscriber base as this would have increased the burden on his wife. White worked hard to increase the circulation despite Cohen's lack of support, but met with limited success. One of his first changes was to reduce the typeface to increase the amount of fiction in the magazine. To pay for this he increased the price of both Fantastic and Amazing to 60 cents, but this had a strong negative effect on circulation, which fell about 10% from 1969 to 1970. In 1972, White changed the title to Amazing Science Fiction, distancing the magazine slightly from some of the pulp connotations of amazing stories. White worked at a low wage, and his friends often read manuscripts for free, but despite his efforts the circulation continued to fall. From near 40,000 when White joined the magazine, the circulation fell to about 23,000 in October 1975. White was unwilling to continue with the very limited financial backing that Cohen provided, and he resigned in 1975. Cohen was able to convince White to remain. White promised to stay for one more year, but in the event remained as editor until late 1978. Amazing raised its price from 75 cents to $1 with the November 1975 issue. The schedule switched to quarterly beginning with the March 1976 issue. As a result, the 50th anniversary issue had a cover date of June 1976. In 1977, Cohen announced that Amazing and Fantastic had lost $15,000. Though Amazing's circulation was as good as it had been for several years, Cohen looked for a new publisher to buy the magazines, but in September of the following year sold his half share in the company to his partner, Arthur Bernhardt. White had occasionally suggested to Cohen that Amazing would benefit from a redesign and investment. He made the same suggestions to Bernhardt in early October. According to White, Bernhardt not only said no, but told him he would not receive a salary until the next issue was turned in. In late 1978, White resigned and returned all manuscripts in his possession to their authors, even if copy-edited and ready for publication. White claimed Bernhardt had told him to do this, though Bernhardt denied it. 1980s to 2000s. Eleanor Maver took over as editor in early 1979. She had worked for Bernhardt as an illustrator and in the production department of several of his magazines, though not for Amazing. She had also been an editor at Bill of Fare, a restaurant trade magazine. Maver had read a good deal of science fiction, but knew nothing about the world of science fiction magazines. When she took over, she was not confident that a woman would be accepted as the editor of a science fiction magazine, so she initially used the pseudonym Omar Gohagan for both Amazing and Fantastic, dropping it late in 1980. Circulation continued to fall, and Bernhardt refused to consider Maver's request to undertake a subscription drive, which might have helped. Instead, in late 1980, Bernhardt decided to merge the two magazines. Fantastic's last independent issue was October 1980. Thereafter the combined magazine returned to a bi-monthly schedule. At the same time the title was changed to Amazing Science Fiction Stories. Bernhardt cut Maver's salary after the merger, as she was editing only one magazine. Despite this, she stayed with Amazing, but was unable to prevent circulation from dropping again, down to only 11,000 newsstand sales in 1982. Shortly after the merger, Bernhardt decided to retire, and approached Edward Furman, the editor of fantasy and science fiction, and Joel Davis, at Ziff-Davis, among others, about a possible sale of Amazing. Jonathan Post, of Emerald City Publishing, believed he had concluded a deal with Bernhardt, and began to advertise for submissions, but the negotiations failed. Bernhardt also approached George H. Sithers, who declined, but put Bernhardt in touch with Gary Gygax of TSR. On the 27th of May 1982, TSR Incorporated acquired the trademarks and copyrights of Amazing Stories. Sithers was taken on by TSR as editor beginning with the November 1982 issue. He was replaced by Patrick Lucian Price in September 1986, and then by Kim Mohan in May 1991. TSR ceased publication of Amazing with the winter 1995 issue, but in 1997, shortly after they were acquired by Wizards of the Coast, the magazine was relaunched, again, with Mohan as editor. This version lasted for only 10 issues, though it did include a special celebratory 600th issue in early 2000. The science fiction trade journal Locus commented in an early review that distribution of the magazine seemed to be weak. The title proved unable to survive. The last issue of this version was dated summer 2000. The title was then acquired by Paizo Publishing, who launched a new monthly version in September 2004. The February 2005 issue was the last printed. A March 2005 issue was released in PDF format. And in March 2006 Paizo announced that it would no longer publish Amazing. In September 2011, the trademark for Amazing Stories was acquired by Steve Davidson, and online publication began in 2012 with 2 issues in July and August. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?